Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Susan Schneider, and I'm the director of the FAU Center for the Future Mind, which is a new center that was founded this semester. So I'm pleased to launch our new book salon series, and Bernie Baars is our first guest. So let me tell you a little bit about Bernie. So we have a very distinguished first speaker. Bernie is best known as the originator of the global workspace theory of consciousness. He's a former senior fellow in theoretical neurobiology at the Neurosciences Institute in La Jolla, California. He's currently editor-in-chief of the Society for Mind-Brain Sciences, and he co-founded the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness and the academic press journal Consciousness and Cognition. He's also the recipient of the International Neural Network Society 2019 Hermann von Helmholtz Award, recognizing scientific life contributions proven to be paradigm changing, demonstrating outstanding research achievements in perception. Now, this salon is on his recent book. I hate to use the expression magnum opus, but it looks to me like one. It's just an amazing read. I've been having so much fun with it. On consciousness, science, and subjectivity. And I thought the best way to say a few things about the book is just to read what other people have said. For example, Daniel Dennett says that for those who want to join the race to model consciousness, this is the starting line, okay? And Murray Shanahan writes, the updated works of Bernard Baars collected here are among the foundational texts of the scientific study of consciousness. Their influence in cognitive science and philosophy of mind is enormous, and their impact on my own thinking has been profound. So I'm excited to give the floor to Bernie, and what we're gonna do is start out with a 15-20 minute elaboration of the global workspace theory of consciousness, followed by a sort of question and answer session between Bernie and myself, designed to tease out certain facets of the book. And then we're going to open it up to questions. Okay, let's get started.
Great, thank you. Let me get my voice into gear here. Thank you very much, Susan. I really appreciate it. And I think the idea of a Center for the Future of Mind, if I've got that correctly, I think that's a wonderful idea and is much needed today when people are so confused about the difference between consciousness, which is a great biological adaptation that fills 80% of our heads, right? I'm talking about the cerebral cortex here, which is the organ of consciousness and fills 80% of our heads. And then, of course, we have a very preliminary, very early beginning of an understanding, I think. But it's an amazing thing to me because this all started when consciousness as a scientific topic did not even exist. So that's my original world. And I still live in that world because it's a dangerous. Consciousness is a swamp, and we need to put little stones down in this swamp to go step by step by step. And my personal approach has been purely empirical, and I would like to say that right at the beginning. Because I think people who try to wander through the swamp without a lot of solid grounding are usually never seen again. And in Florida, you know what happens to them very likely, but we don't know because we just never seen anything again. So thank you, Susan, and let's go for it.
Wonderful. So Bernie, my understanding is that you're going to present some slides on the global workspace theory to give the audience the background. Is that right? You want
yes,
to get
that's the plan.
That's perfect. And the swamp analogy is lovely. And hopefully we can dodge any alligators today.
All right. Are we, oh, Andrew, would you show the first slide?
There we go.
So the title is How to Study Consciousness Without Losing Your Mind. And this is, I suppose, a little jokey, but it's also serious because it is simply unbelievable how many very intelligent, very well educated, very well meaning people wander into the swamp and they don't have constraints. And as we know in science and mathematics, the first thing you do is look for constraints because you know perfectly well that that your journey, if it is not safe, if it's not kept constrained in some way, is going to end in, you know, being eaten by the alligators. And so I just want you to think of this as essentially an empirical journey that then benefited from Alan Newell's work in artificial intelligence and any number of other really extraordinary people in artificial intelligence and now mathematics who also bring things to the table that are really important. And because it's empirical, we start with an operational definition. Consciousness, for our purposes, is anything that people can report accurately. And very often, the great traditional way of doing this was developed 200 years ago, right around 1800, with the beginning of the sensory sciences in what's called sensory psychophysics. And every electronic gadget that we now use, little screens, little headphones and so on, everything, little vibratory surfaces, everything is engineered according to 200 years of first-rate science on the conscious senses. So this is both solidly scientific. It's also very, very practical because we're using it every single day. So slide number 2, please. And you may recognize these characters. And I'm starting with the public health advisory, as we all are doing these days. If this topic makes you feel nervous, please regulate your breathing by counting to 4 silently. And you'll see that feels a lot better right away. So take a deep breath. And of course, we're looking at Plato and Aristotle in this magnificent Renaissance painting by Raphael, which hangs in the Vatican, oddly enough, even though it has all kinds of non-Vatican themes, as you might consider it, because the Renaissance Italians, of course, simply worshipped classical Greece, and the 2 great voices about the human mind, which is always the conscious mind historically. The unconscious mind is a very recent idea, and we'll talk about that, of course. But for most cultures in history, for most great civilizations, when people talked about the mind, they imagined a conscious mind. And Aristotle on the left-hand side, who is older, is pointing to the heavens, which is the realm of Platonic ideas, which is an idea that has been adopted by religious traditions as being compatible with that, although we do not really know what Plato's beliefs were in regard to conventional, what we call conventional religion. And then Aristotle, to his right, who was Plato's pupil, and who wrote the 40 books that we still have from that time, absolutely magnificent books. And the most famous one for our purposes is called On the Psyche. And the word psyche, by the word psyche, a modern linguistic scholar who has translated it and studied its original meaning, with the word psyche, Aristotle really meant the conscious psyche. And as a very great scientist, he was a naturalistic philosopher, which is the same as a scientist today. As a very, very great scientist and founder of the field of consciousness science from a Western point of view, he told us basically what everybody took to be true for about 2.5 millennia. So both of these characters are important, and they should be reassuring to us that we are not the first to try to wander into this swamp, but we are the grateful recipients of many wonderful ancient civilizations that tell us an enormous amount about consciousness, although not perhaps what is publishable today. So the next slide, please. So this is an article that Jerry Edelman, Joe Galley, and I published in 2011 called The Biology of Consciousness in Frontiers in Psychology. And it lays out really the convergence of two very long and very intelligent traditions in the work that we were doing together. Jerry Edelman was a very great Nobelist who received his Nobel Prize in Medicine by solving the earliest in the 1970s, solving the problem of immune molecular receptors which live in the membranes of our immune cells. Joe Galley was his first graduate student. I was his last graduate student, perhaps, or at least I can identify with that tradition. But actually, I also owe everything to Alan Newell in artificial intelligence and a great series of scientific psychologists who I was privileged to learn from. So that was 2021, and I don't know if anybody remembers the 20th century, which was a while ago. Some of you may remember the 20th century. And in 1983, I published a chapter in a book that was called Conscious Contents Provide the Nervous System with Coherent Global Information. That article was basically the seed of everything else I've done since that time, and it was based purely on the evidence that we had in 1983. So this is a very, very long and cumulative tradition of reliable evidence. And then on the bottom, of course, we have Alan Newell's great work called Unified Theories of Cognition. Newell was a great pioneer in computer science, but of course, he was also a great pioneer in what is sometimes called the cognitive architecture tradition, and global workspace theory in its various incarnations is essentially another global architecture. It's not a complete global architecture the way I have presented it, because I have focused on only a part of the available huge literature by now. Stan Franklin, my old buddy from Memphis, University of Memphis, has expanded global workspace theory in one of its artificial intelligence incarnation in a system called LIDA. And it all really started with the group that Newell led at Carnegie Mellon University, and which essentially is expressed in his Unified Theories of Cognition, with what was called the hearsay architecture. And what's interesting to us, there are many interesting things about the hearsay architecture. It was really a demonstration of global workspace ideas, computational ideas, but really also practical ideas, because biology also has its computational side, as you all know. And the important thing about hearsay was that it solved an impossible problem. I was doing psychology of language at that time, and one of my teachers, Jim Jenkins, a very, very great person in cognitive psychology of the time, Jim told me that he didn't think the speech perception problem would be solved for another 50 years. It was just too complex. There were too many ways of interpreting the acoustical signal after it bounced around a standard room and got absorbed by human bodies and by couches and got bounced off glass windows and so on. And the answer was a kind of charade model of computation. Charades being a game, a word game, in which half a dozen people sit around a room and somebody presents a set of cues, and they're not strong cues, so people really have to think very hard and guess. And the various participants who do not know the answer, they're half ignorant, because that's the whole point. At that time in 1990, we were certainly half ignorant about the problem of speech perception. And Alan and his team at that time did a kind of analogy of the game of charades, where the participants were called knowledge sources, but they were very, very imperfect. We didn't have what's called format tracking, which is a more modern way of doing speech analysis and works nicely. But the computers we had at that time were not as powerful. The algorithms were not particularly well worked out by modern standards. But the key thing was to have these half-ignorant knowledge sources competing, cooperating, and above all, communicating to solve problems that none of the participants could solve by himself or herself. And that's the key insight in global workspace theory. And it is important that this is practical, because biology cares about practical. Biology has lots of profound theoretical ideas that are involved with it, and which show us a different world from the conventional world of classical mathematics, for example. Biology has different ways of operating that have been studied, as you know, in recent decades in very revealing ways that have had very practical consequences in terms of deep learning and massive parallel interactive information processing. And a lot of these things go back to Newell's work on hearsay. So the key idea is that it's kind of the wisdom of markets. If you put a lot of smart people together, but with very incomplete information, then somewhere along the line, if you can have a bulletin board or a blackboard or a global workspace on which anybody can post their guesses about the answer, then others can say, no, 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 that's wrong, or yes, I agree. So you can vote for the current posted hypothesis about the incoming sound, and people cooperate, they compete fiercely. But the essential thing about a global workspace architecture is that people have to communicate with each other. So we make each other more adaptable, more intelligent, perhaps, and more able to predict something that none of us as individuals could predict. And that's the basic idea. So next slide, please. And here are your ancestors and mine. And this is from an old movie, which is quite wonderful, called The Quest for Fire. These people are being chased by a very stubborn and determined looking lion, which is quite realistic about our ancestors. And these people are running through what looks like an open hillside. And that is, of course, the African veldt, the ecosystem that in which humans emerged about 2 million years ago as bipedal and tool making, hands using creatures, which are formerly called Homo habilis and Homo erectus. And I think there's an ongoing debate within paleoanthropology about whether Homo erectus can be proven to be the same as Homo habilis, but I'm fortunately not an anthropologist or an archaeologist, so I can say, yes, I'll bet you that those things evolved at the same time. People started to walk on their hind legs, and about the same time they liberated both their chests for breathing and also their hands and arms for tool making. Human beings are tool makers, and we do not know exactly how far that goes back, but the current evidence, I think, shows that we've been tool makers for something on the order of 1 million years or so. And the kinds of tools that we made, of course, were the kinds of tools that hunters and foragers needed to survive. And the other thing we did, because we are rather small-bodied, but pretty fierce critters, the other thing we did is because we can't individually survive the attack of a lion or any other serious predator in Africa, we banded together in small groups, very much like the canids did. The canids are the dog-like species in the world, and there are many of them, but most of them, I believe at least, are pack hunters. And we therefore have to be very social and very intelligent as well, and very communicative, because we have to make sure that if we are the alpha male or the alpha female in the family, most of them were family members because that's genetically how people get to know each other. So there are these wolf packs, ancient wolf packs, ancient ancestral canids, canines, but they're called canids right now for technical reasons in biology. And so the alpha animal has to have street cred, and you only keep street cred as long as you can figure out where the prey animal is to be found and is to be hunted and slaughtered and eventually cooked and eaten. That's a major ingredient in human evolution for the last 2 million years, which is about the ancestry of the genus Homo. And that's us, looking handsome and cute, as you can tell, and very intimidating by waving spears and screaming. We also scream because we're afraid. And sometimes you can't tell the difference. Next slide, please. Now, life on Earth is absolutely chock full of ambiguities And that is something which you and I may not understand. One very obvious domain of ambiguity is the domain of words. So if I use the word bit for all of you today, you're going to interpret the word bit in a particular way, given the context that we've got here. But go back 100 years, and what do you think, and I'm seriously asking everybody this question, what do you think the bit probably meant to most people at that time? Any good guesses? I don't know if we're set up to do a Q&A right now, so I'm just going to leave you with that because it's a good question. It's a good question, and I'm not going to answer it because I don't know the answer for one thing, but also because bit is like all the other common words in English. It is highly ambiguous. And when you ask a question, as I just did, out of any particular context, then you can think of a number of meanings and syntactic roles and so on of the word bit. So my claim is therefore that resolving ambiguities that surround us, and they're both internal, we get ambiguous signals from the body, as people in medicine have long understood. If you feel some pain in the body, for example, it is very often referred from its actual origin in tissue damage to another place in the body. So we think we have a pain in our left arms, and in fact, it's coming from another part of the body. That's an ambiguity. The life as a cat stalking through grass is filled with ambiguities and even changing ambiguities from moment to moment as the cat stalks very carefully through the grass in order to find its prey, and it must find its prey or it will die. So resolving ambiguities must be a major Darwinian survival and reproductive challenge, and it has to be one that repeats over and over again. So you and I can wonder about the meaning of the word bit because we are language using creatures with pretty large vocabularies. But prior to the emergence of spoken language, which is guessed to be about 200,000 years, but that's only a guess. My guess is that it's actually much earlier, but that's a guess too. But the point is that ambiguities were encountered by hominids and by earlier ancestors, pre-hominid ancestors, every day. One ambiguity after another. And you can just imagine what it was like living in arboreal lives as hominoid apes, human-like tree dwellers. And that was before 2 million years ago in Africa. And after that, we became bush and field dwellers. And that had to be a challenge that we had to surmount time and time again, so that you and I like to wander around green bushes and lush fields. It's very pleasant, very peaceful. But this cat can only hunt in the tall grass by pre-consciously, and that's important, let's call it by unconsciously resolving visual ambiguities before the sight of a mouse scurrying away and diving into a hole in the ground, before that sight, which is a conscious and coherent, self-consistent percept, before that percept can appear in the mind, in the brain of the cat. And we know with near certainty that that occurs in visual cortex for the cat, but it also involves a lot of other places in cortex and some outside of cortex as well. I'm going to be talking mainly about cortex in this talk because it is the organ of conscious mentation, which is actually a quote from one of my heroes, the great surgeon Wilder Penfield, who worked on human beings who were epileptic. This is before we had any brain mapping equipment to speak of. So at that time, surgeons working on very seriously ill epileptics had to open the brain, open a flap in the skull, be sure it was still vascularized and living and all that good stuff. Inject a local anesthetic around the edges of the flap and keep the patient awake and happy by talking to the patient. There's no pain to be felt by probing the brain, not that part of cortex in any case. So this was a painless situation where ultimately 1,200 epileptic patients were studied surgically over a 30-year period by Penfield and his colleagues at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And this is a fantastic archive of evidence that is now being built on because the operation is still being performed for epileptics who cannot be cured by medicines alone. So this is not your first line of treatment. You don't just open people's brains up and see what you can find. But it was enormously important, and 1,200 patients over 30 years. Penfield and his team learned a great deal that we tend to think of as modern discoveries, and they are modern discoveries because now we can verify all of that. But the basic evidence comes from the surgical series at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And here is a cat who has a brain very much like ours. It's a smaller version, but cats are brainy creatures. This one looks very alert, at least to my eyes, and probably stalking very, very quietly in such a way as to maintain its posture, the height of its head and eyes, and so on. And that's important because you need a stable platform from which to use your eyes. And the cat is at the same time sniffing, of course, breathing in molecules. It looks like it has its ears pricked up, and it can therefore use binocular integration from 2 points to outer ears, the pinnae, as they are called, to spot a single coherent integrated percept, namely a running mouse that may be a yard away, for example. And the only way for the cat to accomplish this biologically is to take in quite ambiguous fragments of information, to go fixation by fixation, just like you and I do when we are reading what you may be reading right now. You go fix by fix by fix, let's say about 100 milliseconds per fixation. That's the conscious moment in reading and in seeing. And then we jump the eye, we literally twirl the eye the way you would twirl a billiard ball in a pocket of the billiard table. The eye, that's a saccade, a jump, and the saccade is pretty good. It gets it close to the target, but not entirely at the target. And then the 6 powerful muscles surrounding the 2 eyes make finer adjustments and go feedback loop into the target itself. Foveally, the most high resolution part of the both eyes is only about 2 to 4 degrees of visual arc. It's about the size of 2 fingers. If you hold up 2 fingers at arm's length, that's about the size of the fovea. So the high resolution ability of our eyes is quite small. It's only a small patch of the visual world. Then we jump from fixation to fixation, and our wonderful cortex fills in the rest. The information that actually comes into the fovea is therefore very fragmentary. It's full of ambiguities, local ambiguities. These ambiguities have to be resolved by prior knowledge, which the cat has a great deal of, and also by learning at the very moment that the cat is stalking and beginning to see the first inklings of that running mouse. It's a very difficult task, and it has to be done with both top-down and bottom-up processing. Next slide, please. So this is the organ of consciousness. The technical term is it's the corticothalamic complex or corticothalamic system, sometimes called thalamocortical. But the scientists who did the best research on this, that I know at least, Mircea Steriad, in animals, preferred to call it the corticothalamic because he thought, and he was quite right about this, that the signal generally starts within the cortex, then cycles down to the corresponding nucleus of the thalamus, which is thalamic nuclei look like little bumps, little nuts, or beans, but in fact they are cortex. They're just little pieces of cortex that are folded over like a layer cake. There are 6 layers within the visual and the auditory thalamic nucleus. And what you see here is a kind of reconstruction based on biological evidence about neurons in the cortex. And you can kind of see how the major pathways, neuronal pathways, radiate out or appear to radiate out from the thalamus. As it turns out, they're not exactly, they're anatomically radiating outward, and that's what they usually are called in medicine. They're cortical radiations of the sensory input. But what's really going on at the neuronal level is bidirectional signaling, and that is a very important insight that drives my friends who are engineers, drives them nuts, because they're taught, of course, they've learned that excitatory feedback is going to blow up your microphone and loudspeaker circuit. You put that microphone next to a loudspeaker, and just the tiniest little noisy air movements at the microphone are going to be amplified by the loudspeaker, which is going to be re-amplified by the microphone, and so on. It's a positive feedback loop, and it's a formula for a disaster. So most systems that, well, in fact, they're not systems. Most positive feedback loop destroy the systems they are part of. And so engineers, quite rightly, learn how to regulate positive feedback loops with circuit breakers and stuff like that. Somehow, in a very puzzling way, biology has worked out a way to allow this enormous organ to run on a trajectory that is near catastrophe, but only near catastrophe because the cortex is generally extremely stable during waking consciousness. It does break down. Its signaling does break down in epileptic seizures, which is one reason why epileptic seizures are so important, because they are failures. They're predictable failures of a system that consists of an immense, about 100 million neurons with about 250 quadrillion synapses by recent estimates. And you've got this whole thing essentially consisting of excitatory feedback loops They are glutamatergic, so they're excitatory, they're long, they tend to have long axons and dendrites. And so this is a very dangerous adaptation that somehow biological evolution and individual human development, because the cortex also develops from quite early on in gestation to the rest of life, really. So very early on, we have this cortex learning how to operate in a stable way. And if you can find the answer to that, you can get a Nobel Prize. And next, please. And here's another and better view of the relationships between the thalamus and the cortex. And this is the corticothalamic system. And I should mention, by the way, that the thalamus even today is not completely understood. We are obviously learning much, much more about it. But traditionally, before people had instruments like diffuse fMRI, for example, which allows you to trace the oxygen molecules as they flow through neurons and also through blood vessels and so on. And this allows us to get to the connectome, of course. But before that time, before that high technology was available, people did not have a good understanding of thalamus. I do not know at this point whether we have a half-decent understanding of the thalamus, but obviously we know two nuclei, two small nuclei that look like bumps on an egg, which is the lateral geniculate nucleus and the medial geniculate nucleus, both of them for vision and audition, respectively. And this is a system that we know without doubt by now supports the conscious senses. Next, please. And so the cortex, as you know, has any number of highly specialized local regions, and a current line of thinking is that this may be a kind of multi-scale specialization, so that sometimes individual neurons have specialized roles, but then little tiny local networks also have their own roles, and cortical columns have their specialized roles. And then patches of cortical columns, which are technically called blobs, also have their local roles. And that was known already around 1900 when microscopists who stared into light microscopes, basically, figured out that there was a histological differences between the local neuronal patches of the cortex. And that was a well-known fact, but totally uninterpretable for perhaps 100 years, until recently we started to understand how cortical specializations work. The major point to take away here is that cortical specializations are kind of fractal in nature, using the word fractal as a metaphor. I'm not mathematically, but the functionality of cortex is both at the level of hemispheres, probably at the level of interhemispheric functionality, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you get down to single neurons. And some of the single neurons will have a highly specialized, very local function. Functionality therefore exists at many levels. And that's another fact about cortex that blows everybody's mind, and we have trouble with it. This is a 2008, I think, simulation of the cortex by Eugene Izhikevich and Gerald Edelman. who published this in this Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And Eugene created this quite wonderful cartoon of the firing cortex that you can download from PNAS right now, and I highly recommend it. Because what you see emerging from that, I should say that all the empirical input into this model came from actual neuronal evidence. So they knew a great deal about cortical neurons across a number of species. And they used that evidence to kind of throw together this cortex-like simulation, which actually turned out to have emergent properties that are really very nice. And one of the emergent properties, if you can see the red blotches, I have a blue arrow pointing to some of the red blotches. Those are surf waves that emerge from the cellular level. They are not programmed into the simulation, they're emergent. And they're one very, very strong reason for supposing that the cortex functions not just via individual neurons, and individual neurons do firing, as you know, so they send discrete signals, but really also by oscillatory population waves. And that also was an insight that I remember coming to from reading Eugene's papers. And the mathematical basis of that is that loosely coupled neurons behave like waves if you get enough of them. And so we have at least two mathematical approaches to understanding cortex. One of them is called spike firing, and that's the level of individual neurons, and population oscillations. And I believe that by now we have direct empirical evidence for just about all the population, all the oscillatory phenomena that have been studied for the last couple of centuries in oscillatory media like air and water. And this allows us to have one important theoretical approach to the functioning of cortex, which I will not mention that particular one because I'll focus on just the present theoretical ideas. Next slide, please. So this weird old organ, which goes back at least the neocortex, the outer helmet-shaped part of the cortex, it goes back to early mammals. Early mammals are emerged in evolution about 200 million years ago. So the cortex has had a while to evolve, and of course it reforms itself over the individual lifetime as well, beginning in utero, in the body of a pregnant woman. And the current evidence seems to indicate that around 23 weeks after conception, the cortex, well, I should really say this. If you have twins in the same womb, they start fighting each other. They're not very strong, so they can't harm each other. But they start boxing and kicking each other around 23 weeks of age. And that's evidence that comes from NIH right now, which is doing a fabulous series of studies on cortex. Now, this weird thing about this thing, and the great paradox that I've been wondering about now for far too long, and I'm not the only one, is how you can have 100 million neurons and a quarter of a quadrillion synapses between them, and have this weird old thing show radically limited capacity, and furthermore, limited capacity that is practically suicidal. if I had a near bad accident about 10 years ago, I guess, driving on a road in Virginia, and I blame Virginia for this because I take these things very personally. And it was a hilly road, so I couldn't really see what was up ahead. And then I had a left turn. It was a two-way road. And then I had to make a left turn, and I somehow got swamped with conscious thinking about the job of driving and turning left on a two-way road without really being able to see oncoming traffic. And I practically hit a gentleman driving a small truck, and we both spun out and braked, and we were okay. But it was a very near thing. And the reason is this biological weirdness of limited capacity. And limited capacity is something that Google and Apple and every single web app developer probably knows all about, because otherwise you can't really create a user-friendly app or user-friendly physical computer. Because computers have to interact with people who all have this limited capacity feature. And the major question, of course, is this a bug or is it a feature? And the fact is that for people who get harmed, and for cats, by the way, who also get harmed by their limited capacity, it's a bug. And for biology, it's a feature. And that means that from a Darwinian point of view, this enormous cortex with its radically limited conscious capacity had to pay for its upkeep. The cortex is perhaps the most costly organ biologically in the body for many reasons that involve a different talk, but very, very powerful reasons. If we do not get fresh oxygen supply from moment to moment as we do our breathing, the cortex will start dying at about 3 minutes. So we have a 3-minute window of opportunity and window of risk, and that is true not just for us, but for all mammals and perhaps for all land-dwelling vertebrates. So this profound biological puzzle, and I think this was well known, of course, by cognitive scientists and psychologists and so on at that time, but people didn't take it that seriously, because when you run into a fact that's a big puzzle, what practical people do is basically shrug their shoulders and go on to the next thing. And I suppose I was different in one respect, in that I got stuck right around 1983 on this puzzle. And I still don't know the answer. And I invite you all to help me think about it, because one of these days we may be able to get the answer. I should mention, by the way, that most of the tentative answers that we have today are completely circular. So that a typical answer is that, well, the basal ganglia have to serialize our actions. And since our output goes, motor output control, goes through the basal ganglia, so therefore the basal ganglia are responsible for limited capacity. But the question that emerges from that is, so why did the basal ganglia evolve in that particular way? And why is there this kind of funnel property of consciousness? And why is it consciousness that has to be so limited? And the unconscious aspects of the cerebral cortex are vast and unknown. Really, we don't have any good quantitative estimate of the information processing and holding capacity, memory capacity of the cerebral cortex. It's way out of, it's big. And that's what we know. Next slide, please. So the metaphor that we get from Plato and Aristotle and any number of other people in human history, most of whom we know nothing about because any records from human history have, of course, been lost. But this is plausibly a very ancient metaphor, although theaters themselves were not built in London, for example, until the time of Shakespeare. But people got around that because they would simply stand up on their horse and scream at other people. And if you were a peasant and didn't have a horse, you would tend to listen to whoever was, whichever horse rider was yelling at you. So in this particular metaphor, the theater metaphor of consciousness, that we can call some function we can call selective attention, does selection. It lights up the conscious bright spot. And so there's a very intimate covariation between selective attention and consciousness, but they are not the same. And that fact that attention and consciousness are not the same is reflected in our everyday language, which goes back to Proto-Indo-European about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. The idea is probably very similar. We ask people to please pay attention, which is an idiom that we use all the time when trying to quiet a classroom of yelling kids. For example, we say, please pay attention. But what we really mean is, please become conscious of this lady opera singer performing in the spotlight on the stage, and everything is dark. Literally everything is dark. All we see is the opera singer because she is in the spotlight. And everything backstage is dark, meaning everything that contextualizes and frames the conscious event is unconscious, and everything in the audience is also unconscious. So this is an attempt to account for limited capacity of consciousness, momentary consciousness, moment-to-moment consciousness, in cycles about 10 hertz. Consciousness can be followed about 10 hertz, but then the duration of a single conscious moment under optimal conditions is about 3 seconds long. So the fading time of a single conscious event occurs over about 3 seconds, and the cycle time, the dwell time of the underlying brain mechanism of consciousness seems to cycle right around alpha or theta oscillations near 10 hertz. Next slide, please. So the latest and greatest version that we've published was in 2013, and this has now been both confirmed and also further developed by some very, very interesting people. I should, first of all, acknowledge Stan Dehaan and Jean-Pierre Changeux in Paris, who have been working on this fundamental set of ideas for decades, and they've been working at the French equivalent of the National Science Foundation. So it's been a very serious and very competent effort. So Stan Dehaan and Jean-Pierre Changeux called their idea global neuronal workspace theory, which I'm very happy about because they're very good. They make very nice neural net models, and they test them absolutely terrifically in very rigorous ways, which I will not cover right now, but maybe during the Q&A. So this is the theory. We're looking at cortex from the left-hand side. So this is the left lateral side of the left hemisphere. And we're pretending to look at the thalamus, which obviously is not really visible because it's covered up by the cortex. And this imaginary person is looking via his or her foveal vision, 2 to 4 degrees of arc, at a stimulus that is being presented for at least 50 milliseconds is a good guess, which makes it possible for his or her brain to become conscious of that information. And Mary Potter at MIT discovered decades ago that one of the things that happens is that if you have, pardon me, if you have two stimuli being presented, one after the other, that the second stimulus will be masked. By the first one will be conscious, the second one will be identical in terms of the activation of the receptor neurons in the fovea, and it will be continue to be identical, certainly up to area V1 of the visual cortex, and probably quite a bit higher. But what happens, according to Dahan and Changer, what happens at area IT or MTL or both is an explosion, an ignition. What they call an ignition, I called it a broadcast in the 80s and 90s when I was talking about this, because I was working off certain, what I now call a media metaphor, because the theater is really an information medium, is it not? It's an information medium where the singing soprano on stage in the spotlight is being heard and is being admired by all kinds of unconscious characters sitting in the audience. In French, the word ignition probably works a lot better than broadcast. So they use ignition, and I'm perfectly happy with that. What does seem to happen, and the evidence now has gotten very solid, and I'm usually very slow in accepting and understanding evidence. So I tend to wait, and a lot of other people get there first, which is perfectly good. And what we know now from very high resolution recordings in the brain, again, many of them in epileptics who are having enormous patches of electrodes being implanted on their cortex. The surgical flap is closed so that the injury can recover, but at the same time, you can still record from cortex. So in one recent wonderful study, they used more than 1,200 electrodes over 6 different epileptic patients in surgery. And so we've got this huge data set, and we now have many huge data sets, and we can see these little ignitions. The hypothesis here, this is a hypothesis sketch, is that some of the ignitions will happen in V1 or near V1. And a particular example that I like for that one is if you're looking at a single star on a dark night and you're properly dark adapted, all that kind of stuff. So you can see the single star. What's coming into your eyes is about a flow of single photons, actually about 16 photons coming into the outer eye and activating only a single visual receptor in the fovea, and that only requires a single quantum of light, a single photon. And since we're essentially dealing with one spot of light at the very lowest threshold of a single quantum of light going into your fovea, going into a foveal receptor, And I believe that that emerges in consciousness probably very early because all the information is available to cortex at that point around V1 or V2, something like that. And I should mention, going back to earlier parts of this talk, that this ignition that happens is predictable from the bidirectional connectivity. I'll repeat that awful phrase. The bidirectional connectivity of every single cell in the corticothalamic system and every other cell in the corticothalamic system. So these are both excitatory cells. They're glutamatergic, and that means that the cortex is always in danger of blowing up, as any half-decent engineer will tell you. And the major question, and this is something that the really wonderful neurobiologists that I've talked to on this is something that keeps them up at night, worrying, why doesn't the cortex blow up? But we know that it doesn't blow up. Although there are children, by the way, who develop early epilepsy and it's transient. So there's no need to do much about it at all, except reassure the child, because it'll go away by itself. And that's also a miraculous question. How the hell does the cortex cure itself in early and reasonably normal epilepsy? So you do get these explosions. They're extremely well modulated, well regulated, but we do not know exactly how. There are some really advanced hypotheses on this. And the hypothesis that I would advocate is that that single star on a dark night does emerge visually, in visual consciousness, very early in the so-called visual hierarchy, which is not a hierarchy at all. And in fact, it can be, by the time you tell your friend, you ask your friend, what's the name of that star that we're looking at? And your friend answers that it's Alpha Centauri or something like that. By that time, your prefrontal cortex is engaged, your Broca's and Wernicke's areas are engaged, and all that stuff cycles. The key idea is that this is all resonant signaling occurring in the cerebral cortex. And resonant signaling allows for ignitions to occur because what you get basically is positive feedback explosions, but they're not enormous, they're very local. Next slide, please. And here's a very pretty experiment by from a group first authored by Sam Duisberg. And what's so pretty about it is that it's very simple. You take a simple flashing light, a very small flashing light, in the left half of the visual field. That's the left half of both the left eye and the right eye, and it comes into the eyeball, both of the eyeballs, and then emerges on the right hand half of the fovea. And from there, for the left eye, it travels, crosses over, and ends up in V1 in the right hemisphere. And if you take the right eye, it just travels straight within the right hemisphere to area V1. And what you don't see, of course, is the thalamic nucleus, the visual nucleus, LGN. But in fact, what we're looking at is resonant activity because the corticothalamic system does resonant activity. That's pretty much all it does, at least for the neocortex. Paleocortex is a little different. Paleocortex being the cortex before the emergence of mammals 200 million years ago. And in this very pretty experiment, what you can see is an explosion around the V1 area of the right hemisphere. And so this is averaged out and processed and all that kind of stuff, but it mostly occurs in the right side area, V1, where this single bright light is probably a flashing light, emerges in cortex. And as you can see, there is an ignition. There's also something of an ignition on the left-hand side, by the way, you can see that. And the reason for that is that there is point-to-point mapping between very fine-grained spots, locations on the right-hand cortex corresponding to locations on the left cortex, left hemisphere. And that travels over the corpus callosum, which is an enormous highway. It is not a block between the two hemispheres. Well, it is that to some extent, but most of the time you can see symmetrical activity in both hemispheres occurring because the corpus callosum is helping the two hemispheres to talk with each other point to point. Next slide, please. And this is another nice experiment run by Jerry Edelman ran this at the Neuroscience Institute, and Ramesh Srinivasan was the first author. I had the misfortune of being one of these subjects in this horrible experiment. So I got to experience the conscious aspect myself, and I did not like it at all. But what we got out of it was this nice signal correlation between the left and right cortex, even though, and I should have mentioned this right off the bat, we're talking about a binocular rivalry experiment, so that either the left eye or the right eye is dominant at any given time. And so we can compare the effects of the conscious input stream to a very closely matched unconscious input stream. And that's, of course, the experimental key to all this research. You have to go to make very, very close comparisons between conscious and unconscious processes. And by now we have at least a dozen very, very well worked out ways of doing that. Binocular rivalry has been studied since the 19th century, and it's quite well understood. And the only additional point about this is that the stimuli use what's called flicker tagging, because that made it possible in 1991 or 1999, I can't remember, to track the stimulus using MEG. So we're looking at picotesla here in terms of the intensity of the signal, of the magnetic signals, going from very light blue to darker blue to black to red to orange to yellow. And we're talking about plus 0.8 picoteslas at the very top and minus 0.8 picoteslas at the bottom. So it's a nice kind of dose response. Next slide, please. And we've seen this before, so please go on to the next one. I just want to read the top. Andrew, if you would backtrack to the one where the top says, one more. And this is a slogan that I would like to broadcast, which is that Cortex does massively parallel computation. And we didn't know much at all about massively parallel computation in the 1980s or even the 1990s. And today, of course, it is headline news for people interested in the web and computer networks, massively parallel computation. Next slide, please. And just scroll on down to, you've seen that one. You've seen that one. We've seen that one. This particular one, by the way, which is the predictive slide. Andrew, would you back up a little until we see the head? Yeah, right there. This is a prediction that we made and which appears in the book that Natalie Gill and I put together called On Consciousness. And basically, this is a prediction based on the evidence that we had at the time. And by now, that prediction has been reasonably well verified by two really excellent research groups. One is an epilepsy medical imaging group, first authored by Wendy Herman, and it appeared by now, I think, about 5 years ago. And involved very high resolution monitoring, direct cortical monitoring of cortex, and showed a spreading phenomena, an ignition phenomena very much like this. The second group that I want to mention is Gustavo Deco's group, which just published a very, very nice article, which proposed an interpretation of consciousness in the cortical connectome, the connectome being the street map of the major connectivities, of the known connectivities of the cortex. And if I get a chance during the Q&A, I will show you an image of the connectome, and with a lot of luck, because I'm not sure that I have it right now. The connectome looks like a mandala. Basically, it's not a mandala exactly, it's a street map, and it's therefore empirical. And mandalas are essentially beautiful artistic products, so they tend to be symmetrical and evenly distributed on all sides and so on. The connectome is an empirical thing, and so like any street map of a huge urban area, it's not even a city, it's a huge urban complex, if you want a metaphor, for the connectivity of cortex. And the connectivity is now the level of physiological resolution that we can study things at. And the DECO group has essentially proposed very intelligently that the equivalent of a global workspace in the connectome is a kind of a dynamic, rich club of connected nodes and links. So you can determine a rich club for any given task, visual task. You can determine that even using fMRI, and of course these days we can do much higher resolution and much better temporal resolution particularly. And so you can propose a hypothesis. And this one is really very nice. The idea of a rich club is basically the idea that most networks in biology and most networks in society tend to follow a 20-80 rule, in which 20 of the nodes in the network are able to broadcast, this is my way of saying it, able to broadcast to essentially all of the network, to 100% of the network, and certainly to the other 80%. So 20% broadcasts to 80%. And because this is a resonance system, the receivers of that broadcast also feed back. They are doing a kind of a handshaking routine with the source of the information, which we now know from the Holland Changeux. One major source of visual conscious information is area IT. IT is the inferotemporal area, inferotemporal meaning the bottom of the temporal lobe. And in area IT, we know from independent evidence, we recognize kind of the standard visual objects of the interpretation of the world that humans make. So we recognize people, we recognize faces, we recognize automobiles and houses, and that level of size, because that's very useful for us as human beings. And then, of course, developmentally, we can also learn to recognize very small ant-sized objects, for example, and very large, enormously large objects like the oncoming hurricane that is heading for Florida even now, as I speak. That's a lie, by the way. That's not true, but it's conceivable. Next slide, please. We've seen that one. Next slide, please. We've seen that one.
Hey, Bernie.
Yes.
I think you're done with your slides, at least the ones you sent me. And I'm wondering if we can go to Q&A now, because we have a fabulous audience and I anticipate lots of questions that would allow you to elaborate further.
Susan, I really want to thank you for regulating my explosive tendencies here. That's exactly what's needed. So thank you very much. And of course, yes.
Okay, so the first person is Lenore Blum. She has a great question for you. And while she asks it, Polly, who's been kind enough to organize this, is going to, I believe, put everybody on screen so we can have more of an interactive Q&A. And people, if they could be kind enough to raise their hand if they have a question, and I'll try to get everybody in order. So Lenore, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi.
Now Lenore's muted. Polly, can you unmute her?
I did.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, hello.
Oh, great, okay, so thank you very much, Bernie. And as you may know, Manuel Blum and me, Lenore Blum, are great fans of yours. So thank you, and it's really great to hear this. So one thing I just want to know, as you know, there are many theories of consciousness, and I wanted to know if you see things like theories that measure consciousness or purport to measure consciousness, like IIT, as being complementary to global workspace. And there's another, I have a zillion questions. Another one is, do you see that feedback and this bidirectional connections as really important also as some of the dynamics of that is critical for consciousness?
Well, the answer to the second part is absolutely yes. It is both clearly critical to the functioning of cortex, because it's found in all the animals that I think have been studied, including humans, with the right resolution to pick up the signal flow in cortex. And we know that the cortex, among other things, is a wave medium, which is exactly what you would expect, of course, from bidirectional connections between 100 million neurons. Firing neurons, if they're loosely coupled from a mathematical point of view, they will vary a little bit. They won't be perfectly synchronized. And what will emerge from that in terms of the population level is a huge variety of oscillations. And we know about standing waves in cortex, for example. We know about traveling waves in cortex. All the kind of, hurricanes, cyclones, and even nonlinear cinematic kind of clicking phenomena in cortex. And this comes from Walter Freeman and Robert Kozma. Very fabulous work, and very puzzling, of course, which is exactly what it should be, because you're not supposed to know the answers at the beginning. Anyway, hello to everybody who's now showing up on the screen. The first question is that the idea that there are many theories of consciousness is simply not true. There are many speculations about consciousness, but if you look at the empirically based theories, we have maybe half a dozen, something like that. and they have considerable agreement among the various points of view. So I don't consider this much of a competitive environment, given the kind of cutthroat competition that scientists are capable of sometimes. This is not a cutthroat thing at all, as far as I can tell. I really admire and like the other people who've taken the trouble to dig into the enormous amount of evidence that's relevant, and I really welcome them. And I keep an open mind because I do not know the answer. If I thought I did know the answer, I would probably, be ready for the final retirement home, which I'm not. Really, I do not know the answer. So Giulio's IIT, Giulio Tononi's IIT is interesting. I question it because that's what we do. And I like Giulio enormously. I met him many years ago at the Neuroscience Institute. We had good conversation. And the IIT idea, I believe IIT, the quantitative idea, is the square of a quantity called mutual information, which is essentially the flow of classical information across some dividing line, some imaginary dividing line. And since it goes in two directions, it's called mutual information, or MI. And I believe that is still the source idea of IIT. My problem with it is that I can't figure out why it's useful. I know why global workspaces are useful because Alan Newell showed us how useful global workspaces can be in the face of this incredible ambiguity of the acoustical signal of spoken speech in a normal room, which is incredibly sloppy, right? We know that our speech echoes from hard surfaces and it gets absorbed in soft surfaces, and we don't speak all that carefully. And the vocal tract, of course, is not a source of digital information. It's a source of analog information, and your tongue is a big, heavy object that has drag and inertia and all these sloppy things. So the signal is a pain to deal with. And by now, of course, we have Siri and any number of other speech recognition techniques. But I think Siri actually still uses crowdsourcing on the web. Yes.
I'm sorry. You have a bunch of questions. So is it okay if I move down the list? Because I don't want to run out of time. So, the next
my
one.
Prefrontal cortex, please.
Okay. Okay. So Congressman Jerry McNerney's here, and he had a question. Do you still have your question, Jerry? Hi.
Hello, Congressman.
Need to unmute here. Well, thank you for recognizing me, Susan and Bernard. I've enjoyed listening here. I'm certainly not an expert in this field, but one of the things that occurs to me is how important all the other bodily parts are in influencing your consciousness, say your kidneys or the muscles in your foot. I mean, all of this stuff has to contribute in one way or another to what is incoming to your brain and influencing the way you make decisions.
Yes, absolutely. So we have a cerebral cortex that interacts with everything. And we now know, of course, about the hundreds of millions of tiny single-celled organisms that live in our gut, and which make it possible for us to produce serotonin, for example, which is the way we calm ourselves down when we fall asleep. So we've got this enormously interactive system, and there's a but that is attached to this, because brain-body integration is a major topic in medicine, it's a major topic in science, and so on. It's a big deal. But what seems to be the case, as far as I can tell, is that things really explode and intensify in this relatively limited cerebral cortex that we have. So the point of view, going back 100 years to people who studied the spinal cord, for example, spinal cord is a big, big highway into cerebral cortex, as you can obviously see. The spinal cord by itself does not support consciousness. And this huge set of peripheral neurons that we have, all the way down to our fingertips, for example, and our tongues, which are both very densely populated with sensory neurons. All that stuff is incoming into the cerebral cortex, but it does not emerge directly from the point of stimulation. So if you put if you burn your finger on a hot surface, for example, that is essentially a local phenomenon that is reported to the cortex, and then the cortex starts to blast it and turn it into a headline within the central nervous system, and then you can act upon it, of course, in a voluntary way. So this is all very traditional. There's been a century of research on that particular question, actually. And this
I thank you for that answer. And I just want to say I appreciate the view that your cortex is ready to explode or fail at any one time and needs a lot of engineering to keep going. So thank you for the presentation.
You're very welcome.
So Bernie, the next question I had on the list was from your friend Scott Kelso. Scott, did he cover everything about the IIT? It seemed like you had a further question.
I've wanted to meet Scott Kelso for years and years and years, by the way. And it's very nice to meet you right now.
Scott, you're muted though.
Oh, is it me?
Hi.
Hello, Bernie.
Good to meet you.
Somehow we missed each other at the Neurosciences Research Institute because I was there in 1997 with Jerry and Giulio Tononi, and your model reminded me of a guy called Eric Loomer. The thalamocortical model was Eric's work with Jerry, right? And then
yes,
Ishikevich picked it up and so on. Anyway, you discussed a little bit the Tononi theory of integrated information theory. I think what he wanted there was the idea that a conscious state, whatever that is, I was going to ask you what are the state variables for consciousness, what do you think there? But everyone agrees, including Stanislas Dehaene, that a conscious state is somewhat both integrated and differentiated at the same time.
yes.
And I'm wondering, I have some ideas about how that actually works in terms of the metastable dynamics of the brain. So you get actually both converging and diverging processes going on at the same time. And I just wondered if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Well, that's absolutely correct. My apologies to Eric Loomer, by the way, who was certainly around and who certainly worked with Edelman, and they co-developed a biological approach to these ideas, which is very much, well, let me put it this way. I think what we're doing, I started off in experimental psychology a long time ago, and then I managed to, wander into something we called cognitive science, and that seems to be an improvement. And then we got into something called cognitive neuroscience. And then I met Jerry and the others, and I realized that we were really doing biology. And because we're still interested in the psyche, I think we're really doing psychobiology. And that's one word for the vast expanse of evidence and theory that we now have access to. And it's a very wonderful thing. It's one of the great, I believe, it's one of the great meeting places in the history of science. And meeting places like this do occur historically. So the question you answer is exactly the right question. I do not know the answer. And I'm going to leave that unanswered because I want to call your attention to really great work that I love by the late Walter Freeman and Robert Kozma. Freeman being a very great neurobiologist at UC Berkeley, and Robert Kozma being a very, very fine mathematician who is fortunately still with us. And I would refer you particularly to the Walter Freeman discovery about layer 1 of cortex. And you seem to be nodding, so I get the impression that you've probably looked at that work. It is fabulous work. It's totally unexpected, which is a very good thing. And it suggests possibly that layer 1 and perhaps the other horizontal layers of the cortex, I think layer 4, also is kind of a dendritic cloth, right? A felt work that has a very intense horizontal connectivity as well as vertical connectivity, because cortex has both of those. But layer 1 is what Walter studied first in rabbits, I think, and then in humans. And it turns out that that he discovered a kind of cortical clicking phenomenon running about 10 hertz, which he viewed from a nonlinear mathematical perspective as an emergent plateau an emergent plateau of stable resonance. So here we can get the word stability, which is so vital in the questions that we're trying to understand. We get a stable plateau for nearly 100 milliseconds, followed by a chaotic collapse, lasting about 5 to 10 milliseconds. And layer 1 is really, really important. And it appears to have this nonlinear zero lag feature, as you know, so that Walter thought that entire hemispheres at the layer 1 level are essentially clicking, and his word for that was cinematically clicking. So you've got this 100 milliseconds stable states followed by 5 to 10 milliseconds chaotic collapses, followed by reorganization. We're talking about self-organization here, right? And another resonance plateau that emerges from that. And so every 10th of a second, the entire hemisphere, or certainly large parts of the hemisphere, reorganize. They go into chaos, reorganize, go into chaos and reorganize. And then the question, of course, is what the hell does this have to do with the normal way we look at the cortex, which is using Fourier analysis, because we're looking at frequencies over time. And for that, Walter and Robert worked out the usefulness of Hilbert analysis, which has to do with spatial frequencies. And essentially, it's analogous to Fourier analysis. But what Walter's insight, he has many important insights, but one of them was that, excuse me, that layer 1 of cortex, which is the felt work, it's a very dense horizontal weave of dendrites. The felt work is driving the vertical volleys, which we normally record and interpret via Fourier analysis. So we're looking at half of what the brain is doing in signaling terms, but not at Walter and Robert's half of what the brain is doing. We're looking at what may be this gigantic, explosive felt work, this cloth that surrounds the other layers of cortex. And because the dendrites that make up the felt work come from the same cells as the axons that emerge vertically, or going cortical-cortical, cortical-thalamic, and so on, they're the same cells. So explosive clicking in the dendrites of the pyramidal cells is going to be reflected in bursts, in volleys that go out of the axons of those same cells. And then, of course, let's say it reaches another pyramidal cell in thalamus, and it bounces back, and you get resonance going back and forth. And in this interpretation, and I don't know if Walter would have agreed with this, but we can kick it around, basically what's happening is layer one picks up, accumulates information, organizes it within about 100 millisecond stable state. That's an all or none state in terms of the Hilbert analysis. And that all or none state serves as a controller for the oscillatory activity of the cortex. So that's at least a hypothesis, and it makes sense. And if we combine it with Deco's idea that we want to look for the rich club, this is not the anatomical rich club, but the signaling rich club, right? So this is all the rich folks at the country club who are buying and selling and trying to talk each other into buying stocks and those kinds of things. They're communicating with each other. That's the key thing. These are not just static connections. They're not just anatomical. They have to do with signaling. And the general idea is that the dynamic rich club may serve as a functional global workspace for cortex. So it's a long answer, and I see you nodding, so so I figure we're talking, right?
Yes, well, of course, Robert Kozma is a very close friend, and Walter and others we've many discussions together over time. Dynamically, Walter evolved from fixed points to limit cycles, then from limit cycles to chaos with Christine Scarda, and then in the last work onto phase transitions. And of course, in our work, we've been doing work on phase transitions for a long time.
Really? Yes. And that's another
this igniting idea of that's also with Dehaene and Changeux is pretty much what we would call non-equilibrium phase transitions.
Non-equal, yes. I quoted Edelman earlier. The word he used, but the cortex runs very close, if I've got it right.
Instability, yeah.
Too close to instability, so it runs the danger of losing equilibrium and going into a non-equilibrium chaos about 10 times a second. And those are all very profound ideas mathematically and in terms of signal engineering and all that kind of stuff. So thank you for for filling me in on that. And here's yet another, what you keep on learning, of course, after a while, that between Aristotle and Plato, everybody for the last 2,500 years who studied all that stuff had a very, very good idea about it all. So we're talking about the college of intellectuals kicking ideas back and forth over 2,500 years. And so, yeah, we're making progress, and one of these days, who knows?
This is great. And I just wanted to mention this session's being recorded too. So we'll post it up to the center website. The next question, and oh, by the way, it looks like we have a bunch of consciousness junkies here, but I just want to mention, if you need to go, please, feel free to check out. This is, our session has officially gone over, but I did tell a bunch of people in the AGI group in the new center that we were going to be hanging around to talk about some of Bernie's papers that he suggested, including the Deco piece, which has come up and which is great. That is just fabulous. So the next question, so anybody who needs to leave, thank you for coming. It's just been wonderful to have you. The next question is from the Associate Director of the Center, Ilan Barinholtz. Take it away.
So yeah, so the gorilla in the room obviously is the definition of this term consciousness, and it seems to me like you're trying to, in some ways, brush it aside by just operationally defining it as reportability. But does that actually give us anything close to what people want? And are we really are you going to actually make the claim that our theories don't include nonverbal humans, preverbal humans, nonverbal other species? I presume that. Perhaps you are. If you're committing to it, then are we? Is that actually an implication? Is the theory only meant? In which case, why don't we just call it a theory of reportability? And why even refer to it as a theory of consciousness? It seems to me.
That would be fine. That would be fine to call it a theory of reportability, and then for you and me as conscious individuals. We probably notice that reportability coincides with subjective experiences. And when you do the careful experiments like Dehaene and Changeux and so on, you can actually experience the first 52 milliseconds exposure. I know a famous scientist in Europe who actually wrote a paper fairly recently called "How Do I Know I'm Conscious?" And I was so tempted to send him the answer or to recommend to him, the solid empirical way to discover the answer. But he doesn't have to ask me; he could just ask Aristotle if he wanted to, because traditionally in traditional philosophy before 1900, this was not news, right? Everybody kind of knew it because traditional Western philosophy is Aristotelian, and it's also Platonist, of course. And so the whole range of kind of common sense conscious experiences was heavily discussed and written about during that long period of time. And what's happened since 1900 and the rise of behaviorism and physicalistic reductionism, I should say the wrong kind of physicalistic reductionism, because the crucial thing in reductionism, of course, is not, are you going to explain one thing in terms of something else? The crucial question is, how are you going to do it? And what level of reduction is going to serve your purposes of trying to understand to the maximal degree? So if you're Albert Einstein, you don't really want to see quantum phenomena at all, right? Because they violate your deep intuitions about the nature of the universe. So there are certain levels of reduction. If you're a modern particle physicist, you do want to see quantum phenomena. You want to see them even where they might not exist. So we have to get the right level of reduction. And we can use neurons, for example, but neurons are always contextualized by other neurons, and they're contextualized by the amount of glucose and the current surge of glucose that's coming through the bloodstream to feed this very hungry cell so that it can operate in many, many different ways. It has all kinds of information processing type operations. I want to use that phrase very carefully. So the individual neural cell is a kind of network. It is surrounded by other cells that also creates a larger network, and so on. And so we have this multi-scale phenomenon, and for each empirical study, we want to look at a particular level of reduction. That's very, very important. But we're talking about biology, right? And so we're talking about, in case of the neocortex, the helmet-shaped outer cortex, we're talking about 200 million years of mammalian evolution. And there's a lot happens during that period of time at many, many levels of evolution and life development. And as we know, of course, by the time we get consciousness emerging in utero, by that time, the cortex begins to operate on a second-by-second basis, acquiring new links and pruning out useless neurons and doing all that work of adaptation, again, at many, many levels of analysis. So I'm not a reductionist. I'm not any specifiable reductionist, let me put it that way, except perhaps pragmatically, and pragmatically doesn't commit you to anything, basically, as you probably...
Pragmatically, by pragmatically, you mean in a way that solves the scientific problem, so to speak, of measurable, something measurable, but at the same time, it still is synonymous with other levels of explanation.
I would certainly think so. For scientists who are interested in the goals of science, it's certainly pragmatism means that, essentially what you just said. But more broadly, pragmatism has to do with testing truth by function. And by function, we do not mean mathematical functions, of course. We mean biological functions, which are totally different. And it's sort of too bad that the same word is used because it is confusing. But biological functions have to ultimately do with survival and reproductive fitness. And so we can use those as reasonable criteria for the evolutionary aspects of the conscious brain. And then, of course, we get the experiential aspects of the conscious brain, which may begin around the 23rd week of gestation, and certainly by the time of normal birth, of full-term birth. We're looking at a conscious brain because the newborn's brain, the language that's used is that it looks like it's dreaming. Well, dreaming is a conscious state. And that has been known, as you know, for 50 years, because dreaming was called paradoxical sleep by the person who discovered it. And the word paradoxical sleep really meant a brain that looks like it's awake, but it's behaviorally sleeping. So you've got your eyes closed, you're lying back, you're turning, and whatever you need to do to stay comfortable enough in sleep. But if you do an EEG, and even 50 years ago, the EEG was good enough to pick up the fact that you're no longer seeing slow waves. You are seeing what then was called low amplitude, high frequency, random looking activity. And we now know, this is a very embarrassing confession, and it only is for people in science who won't tell anybody in the real world, and particularly not tell Congress members about this. But for most of my career, we had it all wrong about the waking state. And the reason why we had it all wrong is because humans have a thick skull, which reduces the signal to noise ratio from the cortical signal noise ratio, which is measured in millivolts, as we perfectly well knew, to microvolts, which is the best we can do in scalp recordings, at least until recent times, but I don't even want to talk about that. So, so what we get is a massive 99.9% signal loss when we only use scalp recordings. And that's a kind of a revolutionary, oh my God, you know, slap your forehead and say dirty words thing, because it means that we have been misunderstanding the difference between conscious and unconscious, natural unconscious state, meaning waking and deep sleep. We have been misunderstanding that until really quite recently. except for Waldo Penfield, who understood it very well around 1920.
Okay, fabulous. Now, it looks like everybody's still riveted. I guess I'll check in one last time if there are more questions, and forgive me if I missed anybody. People need to raise their hands. We have to get you back, Bernie, like come to our group meeting.
Oh, this is great. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. And let me just check in if there are any others.
Susan, I think Chris Notaro had a question.
Okay, and I'm seeing Manuel Blum as well. Okay,
Hello.
so Chris, do you have a question? And then Manuel, that is, sorry.
Can you wait? There you are.
Oh, you're muted. Yep.
I think Chris was going to ask.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
I can hear
Hi.
you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So my question has to do with Gallup. Not George Gallup. It's well. Anyway, Gallup's mirror test. You know the mirror test.
I do.
And,
yes.
And we, Lenore and I, have both thought of the mirror test as being maybe a first attempt at getting a sense of what is conscious or not. And it's rather interesting that there are two animals that most people would not expect to have any sense of consciousness, but that pass the mirror test. And I'm thinking of the fish, which is the cleaner wrasse, which does pass the mirror test, and an ant.
Hey.
That also does pass the mirror test.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
Well, I think the facts that you've just mentioned show us both the good and the bad aspects of the visual mirror test. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So of course you're quite right. Dogs don't pass the mirror test, but they pass something called the smell test.
There you go.
And children don't pass the mirror test until they're about 2 to 2.5 years old.
Ah.
So my question is basically, we think that the mirror test is a very good beginning for a test for consciousness. And have you thought about anything like that?
Yes, I have, but because I need to follow a very narrow empirical trail. I did not like the mirror test when it was first proposed, and had a lot of impact, right? And the reason why, well, I can, right now I can give you two important reasons. One of them is that humans are very visual, and so a visual mirror test makes sense for humans, and you've just informed me that it makes sense for humans older than 2. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So that makes sense for us folks, and naturally we project our own concepts of consciousness into whatever we're studying. So the mirror test was very appealing at a time when, in a sense, people had forgotten 2 centuries of sensory psychophysics, because the word psychophysics, of course, as you know, means mind-body. And Fechner's belief at the time, Fechner was a very good physicist, his belief at the time that the relationship, the very regular logarithmic relationship between physical sensory input and subjective reports and using a variety of methods, that logarithmic relationship proved, or should prove, to every sensible person in the world that there is no mind-body separation, because they have such a wonderful mathematical relationship to each other in terms of sensory intensities, at least. Well, that's the traditional view, and the word empirical, in fact, historically, if I got my history of philosophy correct, historically empirical meant sensory consciousness. And if you talk to the average guy working on the frozen windmills in Texas today, and you ask them about consciousness, they won't know what the puzzle is, because they use consciousness every single moment of their working lives, and they better do that, because otherwise they're going to get hurt, and they know that perfectly well. So there is this gulf between intellectual philosophers who don't talk to enough plumbers and the rest of the practical world, where sensory consciousness by itself, as long as you can accurately point to it or describe it in words if you're going to be fancy about it, but a simple pointing test and a simple match-mismatch test, which animals can do, is essentially the accurate description criterion. It should be actually a voluntary description criterion of consciousness. And that's what Fechner and the gang used since 1800 or so. So there's this very strange gulf, which I blame on the philosophers, because they like being blamed since they're basically doing a rhetorical act, and they just love to argue. And I don't, I love to argue up to a point, but then I get frustrated when they seem to be making the same argument over and over again. So this is my public complaint against my friends like David Chalmers and Dan Dennett and so on, who are extremely brilliant. And they have been brought up, not their fault, by the way, in an Anglo-American tradition of anti-empirical or non-empirical philosophy. That's got started with Bertrand Russell, who I think was guilty of introducing that through his immense influence in the English-speaking world. And it was Bertrand Russell who celebrated John B. Watson's first book in the British press. And that made Watson a world figure, and it made radical behaviorism respectable. So that's a very, very strange phenomenon in human history, but science does have taboos, just like other human groups. We have our taboos, and sometimes we get into terrible trouble because of our taboos.
So, Bernie, we better wind things up, I'm afraid.
Yes, this is fun.
This is so much fun. We have to get you back. And I want to thank you so much. And I also want to mention to the audience that David Chalmers, he will be coming soon. We're probably going to get him out here in person. And I've invited Dan Dennett as well, who is also very excited about the center, so they can defend themselves. Although Dennett adopts your theory of consciousness, mind you, and he's sick of philosophers too. But anyway, we just had such a great time. And let's see, I want to announce our next events just very briefly. And if you want to learn more about Bernie's views, do read his wonderful book. It's only 650 pages.
Yeah, it's a snap.
But I'm reading it by the pool. I mean, it is a real terrifically accessible read. I mean, it's a blast. So the next event is joint with the Brain Institute at FAU, and we're bringing in our own Ilan Barinholtz, as well as the famous Jill Tarter, the woman who inspired the film Contact, the Carl Sagan film / novel, to talk about alien intelligence, what it would be like, and whether there would be convergent evolution. What do brains need to have to get to the level at which, they create things like create civilizations, for example. So it will be speculative, but it will be much fun. And that's joint with the Brain Institute. And then after that, we have Stuart Russell on AI safety. Bernie, you should come because you and I have had some really fun discussions about artificial intelligence. I know you have your worries. We didn't even get to these. But, you know, Stuart is the author of this wonderful book called Human Compatible on AI safety, as well as I don't know how many of you saw the Slaughterbots videos on drone safety, which are, you know, very frightening, highly recommended, but very frightening.
Mhm.
Okay, so thanks for coming today, everybody. And Bernie, thank you so much for your time and for, you know, being so incredibly informative.
Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate this. And I think this is one of the first talks or Q&As that I've had where everybody was able to ask these deadly questions, which I have tried to field, and we'll see where all that goes. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.